A grass-covered earthen mound rises nearly 100 feet into the sky above the Mississippi River floodplain, its flattened summit large enough to hold several football fields. Built entirely by hand from an estimated 22 million cubic feet of soil carried basket by basket over generations. At its peak, sometime around the year 1100, the city surrounding this mound was larger than London was at the exact same moment in history, its plazas and neighborhoods stretching for miles along the river, home to a population that would not be matched by any city built later within the borders of the modern United States for another 700 years. For more than a century after American settlers first documented these earthworks in detail, the official and widely accepted explanation for who built them had nothing to do with the Native American nations who actually lived in the region. Instead, prominent scientists, congressmen, and popular writers confidently proposed an entirely invented vanished race, sometimes described as a lost tribe of Israel, sometimes as ancient Vikings, sometimes as refugees from Atlantis, anyone and anything except the ancestors of the indigenous peoples still living on the very land where these mounds stood. There is more here for you, if you would like it. If you find a place like this one, quiet, patient, built for the long dark of a winter night, consider subscribing, so the channel can keep finding you when you need it most. And for those who would like a little more, channel members receive early access to every documentary before it appears here, and a quiet way to support the slow work these stories take to make. Tonight, though, we go back to the river. What actually happened at Cahokia? Who really built this remarkable city? How it managed to organize the kind of coordinated labor that raised more than 100 separate mounds across a coordinated urban landscape? Why it collapsed and emptied out within a few short generations, and how thoroughly the truth of its own history was buried beneath a century of deliberate, racially motivated denial, forms one of the most really important and most underappreciated stories in the entire history of American archaeology. Tonight we trace that story from the city's sudden, explosive rise through its equally sudden decline, into the long, strange fight over who was even permitted to be its rightful builders in the first place. Consider what it actually took to erase a city this size from popular American memory so completely that most people alive today, including people who grew up within an hour's drive of the ruins themselves, have never once heard its name. It took more than simple forgetting. It took, as later blocks in this account will trace in detail, active and sustained institutional effort to keep the true builders' descendants from ever receiving credit for what their own ancestors had actually accomplished. Consider what it actually took for a city this size to disappear so thoroughly from popular memory that most Americans today have genuinely never heard its name, despite it standing well within driving distance of a major modern metropolitan area. It took more than simple neglect. It took a century of institutions, textbooks, and popular writers actively choosing a fictional explanation over the true one, because the true one was considerably more inconvenient for the story America was telling itself at the time. No single stone here carries an inscription explaining what happened. No written chronicle survives naming its rulers or recording its own fall. Everything historians and archaeologists know about this city comes from careful, patient excavation, from soil layers and post holes and skeletal remains, pieced together across more than a century of research that had to fight its way past an entire manufactured myth before the real story could even begin to be told properly. The hill rises quietly today above a landscape of suburban streets and interstate highways, easy to drive past without noticing at all. Everything that makes it matter sits compressed into the earth beneath its grassy slope, a century and a half of patient digging still working to fully recover what a century of deliberate denial once worked just as hard to keep hidden. What this businessman-turned-society, this entire American intellectual establishment, actually did to avoid crediting Native Americans with their own history deserves careful examination in its own right, because the mechanism of that denial reveals almost as much about 19th century America as the mounds themselves reveal about the people who actually built them. Cahokia sits in what archaeologists now call the American bottom, a wide, fertile floodplain on the eastern side of the Mississippi River directly across from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, a location chosen by its original builders for reasons that combined rich agricultural soil, reliable river transportation, and proximity to the confluence of three major waterways, the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers, a natural crossroads that made the location actually ideal for both farming and long-distance trade. The site's occupation history stretches back much earlier than its later urban peak, with archaeological evidence indicating people had lived in the area for centuries before Cahokia's dramatic transformation into a major population center. But the specific, rapid urban growth that historians and archaeologists now call the Cahokia phenomenon began remarkably suddenly around 1050 CE, an event so abrupt and so dramatic that some researchers have described it using the term Big Bang, a population explosion and building program that transformed a modest farming settlement into a major city within the span of perhaps a single generation. This rapid transformation coincided with, and was likely substantially driven by, the adoption and intensification of maize agriculture across the wider region, a shift toward corn as a dominant staple crop that provided the kind of reliable, storable food surplus necessary to support a genuinely large, concentrated urban population, freeing enough labor from constant subsistence farming to make possible the massive earth-moving projects and specialized craft production that would come to define Cahokia's urban landscape. At its height, historians and archaeologists estimate Cahokia's population at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the city core itself, with a larger population living in satellite communities scattered across the surrounding floodplain and uplands, some estimates for the entire greater Cahokia region reaching as high as 40,000 people. A population density really comparable to major contemporary cities in medieval Europe and considerably larger than any other settlement that would exist within the future borders of the United States until Philadelphia and New York surpassed it centuries later. The city's layout followed a deliberate urban plan rather than growing haphazardly, mounds and plazas arranged according to consistent orientations that align with cardinal directions and with important astronomical events. Evidence that Cahokia's builders possessed sophisticated surveying knowledge and applied it consistently across a construction program that would ultimately span more than a century of continuous urban development and expansion. The specific soil composition of the American bottom floodplain, deposited over thousands of years by regular Mississippi River flooding, proved exceptionally fertile for the intensive maize agriculture that would come to sustain Cahokia's large population, a natural agricultural advantage that early Cahokian farmers appear to have recognized and exploited considerably more intensively than earlier populations living in the same general region had previously managed. The transition from smaller, more dispersed earlier settlements into Cahokia's dramatically concentrated urban form appears to have unfolded with unusual speed even by the standards of comparable early urban transitions documented elsewhere in the ancient world, a compressed timeline that continues generating scholarly interest in exactly what specific combination of environmental opportunity, political leadership, and religious motivation could have driven such rapid and such dramatic social transformation within so short a historical window. Some researchers have proposed that a specific charismatic religious or political movement may have driven this rapid population consolidation, comparable in its social dynamics to documented cases of rapid religious or political mobilization in other historical contexts, though direct archaeological evidence for the precise ideological content of any such movement remains, understandably, difficult to reconstruct with confidence from physical remains alone. The specific archaeological signature marking Cahokia's rapid initial growth phase, including sudden widespread adoption of standardized pottery styles and consistent architectural forms across a broad area within a remarkably short time frame, suggests some form of coordinated ideological or political movement rather than simple gradual organic population growth accumulating slowly over many separate generations. The full Cahokia site eventually included more than 120 separate earthen mounds spread across an area covering roughly 6 square miles, ranging from small burial mounds only a few feet tall to the truly massive platform mounds that served as foundations for important buildings, a scale of monumental earthwork construction that has no equal anywhere else in North America north of central Mexico, either in the number of individual structures or in the sheer total volume of earth moved across the site's full construction history. These mounds served several distinct functions within Cahokian society. Platform mounds like the massive central structure now called Monk's Mound supporting important residential and ceremonial buildings for the city's ruling elite, conical and ridgetop mounds serving primarily as burial monuments for important individuals, and a specialized category of mounds apparently built specifically to mark significant astronomical alignments, a functional diversity that reflects actually sophisticated understanding of how monumental architecture could serve overlapping political, religious, and practical purposes within a single coordinated urban plan. The labor required to construct this many mounds, using nothing but hand tools, woven baskets, and coordinated human effort, represents one of the more genuinely staggering achievements in all of pre-Columbian North American history. Archaeologists estimating that moving the total volume of earth incorporated across the entire site would have required literally millions of individual basket loads carried by hand from borrow pits scattered across the surrounding landscape to their final positions atop each growing mound. This scale of labor mobilization implies a level of political and social organization capable of coordinating large numbers of workers across multiple construction seasons, whether through some form of centralized political authority commanding tribute labor, through voluntary communal participation motivated by religious or civic obligation, or, as most researchers now believe, through some combination of both coercive and voluntary participation operating simultaneously within Cahokian society's actual social structure. Archaeological surveys using increasingly sophisticated remote sensing technology continue revealing additional structures and features across the wider Cahokia landscape that earlier, less systematic investigation had never fully documented, suggesting the true scale and complexity of the ancient city likely exceeds even the substantial number of mounds already formally catalogued and studied by researchers working at the site across more than a century of accumulated archaeological attention. Comparative studies examining monumental earthwork construction at other ancient sites around the world have helped researchers understand Cahokia's own construction achievement in broader context. The sheer number of separate mounds requiring coordinated construction across a relatively compressed time frame, representing an organizational achievement that few comparable ancient societies elsewhere managed to sustain across so many simultaneous separate building projects. The borrow pits from which builders extracted the enormous quantities of soil used in mound construction remain visible today as shallow depressions scattered across the wider site, their own patterns of excavation offering archaeologists additional evidence about how construction labor was actually organized and distributed across different work crews operating simultaneously at different locations throughout the ancient city. Modern LiDAR aerial scanning technology, capable of detecting subtle ground surface variations even beneath dense modern vegetation and urban development, has proven particularly valuable for identifying additional mound remnants and earthwork features across the wider Cahokia landscape that traditional ground survey methods had previously overlooked entirely. The full extent of Cahokia's original urban footprint likely extended considerably beyond even the substantial area currently protected within the formal historic site boundary, portions of the ancient city having been built over by later agricultural use and eventually by 20th century suburban and industrial development before modern archaeological survey methods existed to properly document what was being lost. The practical logistics of feeding thousands of construction workers across multiple building seasons required its own considerable organizational infrastructure, food storage and distribution systems that historians increasingly recognize as representing an achievement nearly as impressive as the earthwork construction the labor force was actually assembled to accomplish. Monk's Mound, the massive central platform mound that dominates the entire Cahokia site and that takes its modern name from a group of Trappist monks who briefly lived nearby during the early 19th century, stands as the largest pre-Columbian earthwork anywhere north of central Mexico, covering approximately 14 acres at its base and rising in 4 distinct terraces to a height of nearly 100 feet, a scale of construction that required moving an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth across multiple building episodes spanning several centuries of continuous use and expansion. Excavations conducted at Monk's Mound have revealed that its construction proceeded in numerous distinct stages rather than as a single continuous building project, each stage adding new layers of soil and expanding the structure's overall footprint, evidence suggesting the mound functioned as an ongoing, living monument that successive generations of Cahokian leaders continued to enlarge and modify throughout the city's active period, each expansion likely carrying its own specific political or religious significance tied to whichever leader commissioned it. Archaeological investigation of the mound's summit has recovered evidence of a large wooden building, likely serving as either a residence for the city's paramount leader or as an important ceremonial temple, or quite possibly both functions simultaneously. A structure whose specific architectural details remain only partially reconstructed given that wooden buildings from this period have almost entirely decayed, leaving behind only post holes and other subtle traces for archaeologists to carefully interpret. The engineering challenges involved in constructing and maintaining a structure this large using entirely hand labor were really significant, builders needing to understand soil composition, drainage, and structural stability well enough to prevent the massive earthen structure from collapsing or eroding under its own weight, particularly given the region's exposure to significant seasonal rainfall and periodic flooding from the nearby Mississippi River, engineering knowledge that must have been developed and refined through generations of accumulated practical experience with earthwork construction. Modern conservation efforts at Monk's Mound continue grappling with exactly these same structural challenges the original builders faced, the mound experiencing periodic slope failures and erosion events even today that require ongoing stabilization work, a reminder that maintaining a structure of this scale and age demands the same kind of sustained, coordinated institutional attention that its original construction and maintenance would have required from Cahokian society across the many generations of the city's active existence. Radiocarbon dating and careful stratigraphic analysis of soil samples recovered from within Monk's Mound itself have allowed researchers to establish a reasonably detailed construction chronology, confirming that major building episodes occurred episodically across roughly 2 centuries rather than through any single sustained continuous effort, each major addition likely corresponding to a specific political event or leadership transition that current archaeological evidence cannot always precisely identify. The specific soil types used in different construction phases of Monk's Mound also reveal something about the logistics of the project, builders apparently selecting particular soil compositions for different structural purposes, denser clay-rich soils for load-bearing core sections and lighter, more easily worked soils for surface layers. Evidence of accumulated practical engineering knowledge passed down through generations of mound-building specialists. The wooden building once standing atop Monk's Mound would have required substantial timber resources to construct, large support posts likely sourced from mature trees harvested from increasingly distant forest stands as nearby timber resources became progressively depleted across the generations of the city's active construction and expansion. Comparative analysis with earthwork construction techniques documented at other Mississippian mound sites throughout the Southeast reveals both broad similarities in basic construction method and notable local variations, suggesting individual communities maintained their own specific engineering traditions even while participating in a broadly shared regional cultural and religious tradition. Among Cahokia's most scientifically significant features are several circular arrangements of large wooden posts that archaeologists have named woodhenge, structures whose specific arrangement corresponds with notable precision to important solar events including the equinoxes and solstices. Evidence that Cahokian society maintains sophisticated systematic astronomical observation capable of tracking the sun's changing position across the horizon with an accuracy that required sustained, careful observation across multiple years to properly calibrate the largest and most thoroughly studied of these post circles, sometimes called the fourth Woodhenge based on the sequence in which archaeologists discovered successive rebuilt versions of the structure at slightly different locations across the site, consisted of 48 substantial wooden posts arranged in a precise circle, with a position marked for a solar observation post positioned specifically so that the rising sun at the equinoxes would appear to emerge directly from the summit of Monk's Mound itself when viewed from the circle center, a deliberate alignment connecting the city's astronomical observatory directly to its most important political and religious monument. This kind of careful astronomical alignment served practical agricultural functions, helping Cahokian farmers track the changing seasons accurately enough to properly time planting and harvest for their maize-dependent agricultural economy, while simultaneously serving important religious and political functions, connecting the authority of Cahokia's ruling elite to their evident ability to predict and track the movements of the sun itself, a form of cosmological legitimacy that recurs across many early complex societies around the world that developed comparable systematic astronomical knowledge. The wooden posts themselves, unlike the earthen mounds that dominate the wider site, have not survived directly, decaying entirely over the centuries since their original construction, meaning modern knowledge of Woodhenge's precise layout and alignment comes entirely from archaeological excavation identifying the pattern of post holes left behind in the ground. A painstaking reconstruction process that has nonetheless allowed researchers to confirm the structure's true astronomical function with considerable scientific confidence. Reconstructed wooden posts now mark the approximate original locations of Woodhenge for visitors to the modern site, allowing people today to stand at roughly the same observation point Cahokian astronomers once used and watch the sun rise, at the correct time of year, in precisely the alignment those ancient observers originally calculated and built their monument specifically to track. The precision required to properly calibrate an astronomical observation circle like Woodhenge, tracking the sun's position across multiple full years before builders could confidently establish the correct post placements for equinox and solstice observation, implies a sustained institutional commitment to astronomical record-keeping that must have involved dedicated specialists trained specifically in this kind of long-term systematic observation, a specialized professional role within Cahokian society that current archaeological evidence can only partially reconstruct. Additional smaller post circles identified at other locations across the Cahokia site suggest that astronomical observation may have been practiced at multiple points throughout the city rather than being confined to a single centralized observatory, evidence that this kind of systematic sky watching held broader cultural importance extending beyond whatever specific role the largest and most thoroughly studied Woodhenge circle played in the city's central political and religious life. The astronomical knowledge embedded in structures like Woodhenge represents just one dimension of a broader Cahokian intellectual tradition that also included sophisticated understanding of agricultural timing, plant genetics sufficient to develop improved maize varieties suited to the regional climate, and mathematical knowledge sufficient to plan and execute precisely oriented monumental construction across a complex urban landscape. Cahokia functioned as the political and ceremonial capital of what archaeologists now call the Mississippian culture, a broad and influential cultural tradition that spread across much of what is now the southeastern and midwestern United States during the centuries surrounding Cahokia's own peak, sharing common features including platform mound construction, intensive maize agriculture, and a widely distributed set of religious symbols and practices that researchers collectively call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. The specific political structure that organized Cahokian society remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate, some researchers proposing a highly centralized chiefdom governed by a single powerful paramount ruler exercising considerable authority over both the city itself and a wider network of subordinate communities, while other researchers favor a somewhat more distributed model involving multiple powerful lineages or factions sharing authority in ways that current archaeological evidence cannot yet fully resolve with confidence. Whatever its precise internal political structure, the evidence for social stratification at Cahokia appears actually substantial, with clear differences visible in house size, burial treatment, and access to prestigious imported goods between what were evidently distinct social classes, ranging from an elite ruling group enjoying considerable material wealth and ceremonial privilege down to ordinary agricultural laborers whose material remains show much more modest living conditions. Cahokia's political and religious influence appears to have extended across a genuinely wide geographic area, with Cahokian-style pottery, architectural features, and religious symbolism appearing at sites hundreds of miles away across the greater Mississippi Valley, evidence that the city functioned not merely as a large isolated settlement but as the genuine political and religious center of a much wider cultural and possibly political network extending across a substantial portion of what is now the central United States. This wider Mississippian cultural network persisted for centuries after Cahokia's own specific decline, with other major mound-building centers continuing to flourish across the southeast well into the period of early European contact, meaning Cahokia represents not the entire story of Mississippian civilization, but rather its earliest and, in terms of sheer physical scale, most impressive single expression within a longer and considerably more geographically extensive cultural tradition. The specific mechanisms through which Cahokia's ruling elite maintained and exercised authority over subordinate communities scattered across the wider region remain only partially understood, researchers proposing various combinations of religious legitimacy, control over prestige trade goods, and direct kinship or political alliance structures that likely operated simultaneously to sustain the kind of coordinated political authority that Cahokia's monumental construction program would have required. Archaeological evidence recovered from residential neighborhoods surrounding Cahokia's central ceremonial precinct reveals considerable variation in house construction quality and household material wealth, some neighborhoods showing evidence of considerably more prosperous households with access to imported luxury goods, while other residential areas show more modest material conditions consistent with a broader population of agricultural laborers and craft workers supporting the wider urban economy. Burial goods recovered from elite Cahokian graves, including finely crafted pottery vessels, ornamental pipes, and imported prestige materials, provide archaeologists with valuable evidence about exactly which categories of material culture carried the greatest social prestige within Cahokian society, evidence that helps researchers reconstruct the specific value systems that organized social status and political authority within this complex ancient urban community. Household refuse deposits recovered from different neighborhoods across Cahokia provide archaeologists with detailed evidence about everyday diet, revealing a diverse subsistence economy that combined intensive maize cultivation with continued hunting, fishing, and gathering of wild plant foods, evidence that Cahokian food security depended on a genuinely diversified economic strategy rather than exclusive reliance on agricultural surplus alone. The specific relationship between household wealth and formal political rank within Cahokian society remains an active area of ongoing archaeological investigation, some researchers proposing that wealth and formal authority may not have correlated as tightly as comparable studies of hierarchical societies elsewhere might initially suggest. Archaeological evidence recovered from Cahokia reveals a really extensive trade network connecting the city to distant regions across much of North America: marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes region, mica from the southern Appalachian Mountains, and specialized chert stone tools quarried from sources hundreds of miles away, all appearing in substantial quantities within the archaeological record at Cahokia, evidence of long-distance exchange networks that connected this inland Mississippi Valley city to resources and trading partners scattered across a continental scale. Craft specialists working within Cahokia produced finished goods from many of these imported raw materials, skilled artisans transforming raw marine shell into elaborate beaded ornaments and engraved gorgets, shaping copper into ceremonial plates and symbolic ornaments, and carving specialized stone tools including the distinctive Mill Creek chert hose that archaeologists have found distributed across a remarkably wide geographic area, evidence that Cahokia functioned not merely as a consumer of imported raw materials, but as a true manufacturing center exporting finished craft goods back out through its own extensive trade connections. Among the most visually striking objects recovered from Cahokia and related Mississippian sites are small carved stone and shell ornaments depicting a distinctive figure researchers call the long-nosed god, a stylized human face with an elongated nose that appears at Mississippian sites across an actually wide geographic range. Evidence of a shared religious or mythological tradition that spread through trade and cultural contact across much of the wider Mississippian cultural sphere regardless of the specific political boundaries between different regional centers. This extensive trade network required not just the physical infrastructure of river and overland transportation routes, but also the kind of established social and political relationships that allowed goods, and likely also religious and political ideas, to move safely and reliably across enormous distances and between communities that may not have shared a common language or immediate political allegiance. Evidence of a genuinely sophisticated diplomatic and economic system operating across ancient North America well before any European contact introduced comparable trade networks to the continent. The sheer volume and variety of imported materials recovered from Cahokia's archaeological deposits continues to impress researchers studying the site today, each new excavation season typically adding further confirmation of just how really far-reaching and how well-organized this ancient trading network actually was. Much more extensive and more sophisticated than popular historical narratives about pre-Columbian North America have traditionally acknowledged. The geographic origin points for many of these traded raw materials have been identified with considerable precision through geochemical sourcing techniques, allowing researchers to trace specific copper artifacts back to particular Great Lakes mining sites and specific shell ornaments back to particular Gulf Coast harvesting locations. Work that has revealed trade connections extending across distances that would have required weeks or even months of travel using the river and overland transportation methods available to Cahokian traders. The river transportation network that made this extensive trade possible relied on dugout canoes capable of carrying substantial cargo loads across considerable distances, watercraft that, while leaving relatively little direct archaeological evidence given the organic materials involved in their construction, must have represented a genuinely sophisticated transportation technology supporting the entire economic system that sustained Cahokia's urban population and its extensive trading relationships. Evidence of specialized craft workshops recovered from residential areas near Cahokia's central precinct suggests certain neighborhoods may have specialized in particular categories of production, some areas showing concentrated evidence of shell bead manufacturing, while others show evidence more closely associated with stone tool production. A pattern of craft specialization by neighborhood that recurs in comparable ancient urban centers documented elsewhere around the world. The considerable prestige value attached to specific imported materials at Cahokia appears to have been actively managed by the city's ruling elite, control over access to certain rare imported goods likely functioning as a genuine political tool for rewarding loyalty and maintaining social hierarchy within the wider Cahokian political system. Chunky, a game involving rolling a specially carved stone disc across an open playing field while players threw spears attempting to land as close as possible to where the rolling stone would eventually stop, appears to have originated at or near Cahokia and subsequently spread across a remarkably wide portion of North America. Archaeological and later historical evidence documenting the game's play among numerous different indigenous nations scattered from the Great Plains to the southeast. Evidence of one of the clearest examples of a specific cultural practice originating at Cahokia and then propagating outward across the wider continent through the same trade and cultural contact networks that moved physical goods. The specialized stone discs used in chunky, carefully shaped and polished chunky stones recovered in significant numbers from Cahokia and related sites, represent specialized craft production requiring considerable skill to manufacture properly. Evidence that the game held cultural significance substantial enough to justify investing real specialized labor in producing the equipment necessary to play it at a high level. Early European observers who documented Chunky being played among various indigenous nations centuries after Cahokia's own decline described the game as carrying considerable social and even economic significance, with observers reporting that players sometimes wagered substantial personal possessions on the game's outcome, and some accounts suggesting the game carried genuine ceremonial or religious significance beyond simple recreational competition, evidence that Chunky functioned as something closer to an important cultural institution than a purely casual pastime. The game's remarkably wide geographic spread and its persistence for centuries after Cahokia itself had been abandoned offers historians an actually valuable window into how cultural practices and traditions could propagate across ancient North America independent of any single centralized political authority. Chunky continuing to be played by numerous indigenous nations well into the historical period, even as direct political and economic connections to Cahokia itself had long since dissolved, following the city's own decline centuries earlier. Some archaeologists have proposed that Chunky may have served important social functions beyond entertainment, potentially helping to build and maintain social bonds between different communities and even between potentially rival political factions, a function that recurs across many traditional ball games and competitive sports documented in societies around the world, athletic competition providing a controlled, ritualized outlet for competitive social energy that might otherwise express itself through more directly disruptive forms of conflict. Modern reconstructions of Chunky play, attempted by researchers and enthusiasts working from historical descriptions and archaeological evidence, have confirmed that the game required genuine athletic skill and practiced hand-eye coordination to play at any competitive level. The rolling stone disc moving considerably faster and considerably less predictably than casual observers might initially assume from simple textual descriptions alone. The specific rules governing competitive Chunky play appear to have varied somewhat between different regions and different historical periods based on the range of documented accounts collected by later European observers, though the basic core mechanic of throwing spears at a rolling target stone remained remarkably consistent across the game's wide geographic distribution and its long historical persistence. Contemporary Native American communities in several regions continue playing modernized versions of Chunky today, part of a broader movement toward reviving and maintaining traditional games and cultural practices that connect present-day indigenous communities directly to this deep ancestral sporting and cultural tradition extending back well over 1,000 years. Among the most archaeologically significant and most genuinely striking discoveries at Cahokia is Mound 72, a relatively modest-sized ridgetop burial mound that, when carefully excavated during the 1960s and 1970s, revealed an extraordinarily complex sequence of burials spanning what appears to have been a considerable period of the city's active history, including one particularly notable burial of a man laid upon a platform made from thousands of carefully arranged marine shell beads, evidence of the kind of elaborate ceremonial burial treatment reserved for individuals of really elevated social status within Cahokian society. Excavation of Mound 72 also revealed considerably more troubling evidence, including the remains of dozens of individuals, predominantly young women, buried together in what appear to have been simultaneous mass burial events, along with additional burials showing clear evidence of violent death, some individuals apparently having been killed through means including strangulation or blunt force trauma, evidence that researchers have interpreted as documenting human sacrifice connected to important ceremonial or political events within Cahokian religious practice. The specific interpretation of these sacrificial burials remains a subject of true ongoing scholarly discussion, some researchers connecting the practice to the death and burial of important political or religious leaders, the sacrificed individuals potentially representing retainers or attendants ritually killed to accompany a powerful figure into the afterlife, a practice documented in various forms across numerous ancient societies around the world that developed comparably hierarchical, social and political structures. This evidence of ritual human sacrifice at Cahokia complicates any simple, purely celebratory narrative about the city's achievements, revealing a society whose engineering sophistication and genuine cultural achievement coexisted with practices modern observers find deeply troubling, a combination that, however uncomfortable, appears consistently across many complex ancient societies worldwide, and that honest historical accounting requires acknowledging rather than glossing over in service of a simpler, more purely admirable narrative. Ongoing research at Mound 72 continues refining scientific understanding of exactly who these individuals were. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains providing evidence about diet and geographic origin that has revealed some of the sacrificed individuals likely came from communities outside Cahokia itself, suggesting the sacrificial victims may have included captives or tribute individuals from subordinate communities rather than exclusively local Cahokian residents, evidence that adds a significant political dimension to understanding exactly how this practice functioned within the wider structure of Cahokian society and its relationship to surrounding communities. The specific archaeological methodology used to excavate Mound 72 during the original 1960s and 1970s research campaigns, while groundbreaking for its era, has since been revisited by later researchers applying more advanced analytical techniques to the originally recovered skeletal material, work that continues refining scientific understanding of exactly who these individuals were and exactly what circumstances led to their inclusion within this particular and clearly significant burial monument. The broader pattern of mass sacrificial burial documented at Mound 72 finds some comparative parallel in burial practices documented at other major Mississippian centers, though Cahokia's own evidence remains among the most extensively studied and most thoroughly documented examples of this practice recovered anywhere within the wider Mississippian cultural tradition. The specific ceremonial significance of the beaded burial platform recovered from Mound 72, requiring an estimated 20,000 individual marine shell beads carefully arranged in a distinctive falcon or bird-shaped pattern beneath the honored burial, represents one of the most elaborate single funerary constructions documented anywhere within the wider Mississippian cultural tradition. The specific demographic profile of the individuals sacrificed and buried within Mound 72, skewing heavily toward young adult women based on skeletal analysis, has prompted researchers to consider various explanations connecting the pattern to specific ritual or political functions that remain only partially understood even after decades of dedicated scientific study of the recovered remains. Further excavation seasons at nearby ridgetop mounds have continued adding comparative context to the Mound 72 findings, helping researchers place this particular monument within a broader pattern of elite mortuary practice that extended across multiple generations of Cahokian leadership. Religious iconography recovered from Cahokia and related Mississippian sites reveals an actually rich and genuinely complex symbolic system, prominently featuring a figure researchers call the Birdman or Falcon Warrior, typically depicted with distinctive falcon-associated imagery including forked eye markings and wing-like elements attached to human figures. An iconographic tradition that appears across numerous media including engraved shell, carved stone, and copper repoussé plates recovered from Cahokia and other major Mississippian sites scattered across the wider southeast. This falcon and warfare-associated imagery likely connected to broader Mississippian cosmological beliefs organizing the universe into an upper world associated with the sun, birds, and celestial order, and an underworld associated with serpents, water, and chaotic natural forces. A dualistic cosmological structure that recurs across numerous indigenous North American religious traditions and that appears to have provided the underlying conceptual framework organizing much of Cahokian religious practice and political legitimacy. The elaborate copper plates recovered from Cahokia and related sites, carefully hammered and engraved with intricate birdman and other religious imagery, represent some of the most sophisticated metalworking achieved anywhere in pre-Columbian North America, craftspeople working native copper, extracted through cold hammering techniques rather than smelting given the absence of the kind of high-temperature metallurgy developed independently elsewhere in the ancient world, into finished objects, requiring considerable skill and patience to produce successfully. Contemporary descendant indigenous communities across the Southeast and Midwest maintain their own oral traditions and cultural knowledge connecting to this wider Mississippian religious and symbolic tradition, knowledge that, while inevitably transformed and reinterpreted across the centuries separating the present from Cahokia's own active period, nonetheless provides valuable interpretive context that purely archaeological analysis of recovered objects alone cannot fully supply, an increasingly important resource as researchers work to develop more really collaborative relationships with descendant communities studying their own ancestral heritage. The specific religious meaning and function of individual symbols and images within this wider iconographic tradition remains only partially understood even after decades of dedicated scholarly study, researchers continuing to debate the precise significance of specific recurring motifs and the exact relationship between religious belief, political authority, and the elaborate material culture that Cahokian and related Mississippian craftspeople produced across the wider period of the cultures. Active development and geographic expansion. The specific artistic style associated with Birdman and related Mississippian iconography shows considerable internal consistency across the wide geographic area where it appears, suggesting either sustained direct contact between artisans working at different regional centers or a shared training tradition that maintained consistent stylistic conventions even as individual craftspeople worked at considerable geographic distance from one another across the wider Mississippian cultural sphere. Engraved shell cups and gorgets recovered from Cahokia and related sites often depict complex narrative scenes involving multiple figures and symbolic elements, artwork that researchers continue working to properly interpret, some images apparently depicting specific mythological narratives that, while no longer fully understood in their original cultural context, clearly held considerable religious significance for the people who created and used these objects. The underworld half of this dualistic Mississippian cosmology, associated with serpents, water, and chaotic natural forces, appears in its own distinct body of iconography featuring horned or winged serpent figures that recur across engraved shell and copper objects recovered from Cahokia and other major Mississippian ceremonial centers throughout the wider Southeast. Specialized ceremonial regalia depicted in Mississippian art, including elaborate feathered headdresses, ear ornaments, and ceremonial weapons, provides additional evidence about the material culture of political and religious authority within Cahokian society. Objects that likely marked specific ranks or ceremonial roles within a complex social hierarchy that current evidence can only partially reconstruct. Cahokia's decline, beginning sometime in the 13th century and accelerating much through the 14th century before the site was substantially abandoned by around 1350 to 1400, has generated considerable scholarly debate regarding its underlying causes. Researchers proposing several overlapping explanations rather than any single definitive cause that fully accounts for the city's dramatic transformation from a major urban center into an essentially empty landscape within the span of just a few generations. Environmental degradation represents one commonly cited explanatory factor, archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence suggesting that Cahokia's massive population placed considerable strain on surrounding natural resources, particularly forest cover in the immediate region. Extensive deforestation likely required to supply the enormous quantities of timber needed for construction, fuel, and the wooden palisade walls discussed in the following block. Environmental pressure that may have contributed to increased flooding and soil erosion as the protective forest cover surrounding the city gradually diminished across generations of sustained human exploitation. Climate change affecting the broader region also appears to have played a significant role, the period of Cahokia's decline coinciding with the end of what climatologists call the medieval warm period and the beginning of a cooler, more variable climate phase sometimes called the Little Ice Age, a shift that likely reduced agricultural productivity for Cahokia's maize-dependent economy and that affected societies across a wider geographic area well beyond the Mississippi Valley during roughly this same historical period. Political instability within Cahokian society itself may have compounded these environmental pressures. some researchers proposing that internal political competition, factional conflict among rival elite lineages, or a gradual erosion of the paramount leader's true authority over subordinate communities across the wider Cahokian political network may have made the society considerably less capable of coordinating the kind of large-scale collective response that addressing environmental and agricultural challenges would have required. Whatever the precise combination of environmental, climatic, and political factors ultimately responsible, the archaeological evidence suggests Cahokia's decline unfolded as an actually gradual process extending across multiple generations rather than through any single sudden catastrophic event. Population apparently declining steadily as successive waves of residents chose to leave the city for other communities. A slow demographic drain rather than a dramatic, instantaneous collapse. Pollen analysis and other paleo-environmental evidence recovered from sediment cores near Cahokia has provided researchers with a detailed record of vegetation change across the site's active occupation period, confirming substantial forest clearance occurring in the immediate vicinity of the city during its period of peak population. Evidence that lends considerable scientific support to theories connecting environmental strain to the city's eventual decline. Comparative climate data recovered from tree ring analysis and other paleoclimatic proxy records across the wider Midwest region confirms that the period of Cahokia's decline coincided with documented drought events and increased climate variability affecting agricultural productivity across a considerably wider geographic area than just the immediate Cahokia region alone. Some researchers have specifically proposed that repeated seasonal flooding, intensified by the environmental degradation resulting from extensive deforestation in the immediate Cahokia region, may have periodically destroyed agricultural fields and stored food surpluses in ways that gradually undermined the reliable food security that had originally allowed the city's large population to grow and sustain itself in the first place. The combination of environmental pressure and reduced agricultural reliability appears to have particularly affected Cahokia's capacity to sustain the kind of large food surpluses that had originally supported its substantial non-farming population, including craft specialists, religious officials, and the ruling elite. Populations whose continued support depended directly on agricultural productivity remaining consistently high across successive growing seasons. Archaeological evidence for increasing social tension and potential organized violence during Cahokia's later period includes the construction of a substantial wooden stockade wall, a defensive palisade that eventually enclosed the central ceremonial precinct of the city, requiring an estimated 20,000 individual logs to construct and subsequently rebuilt at least 3 separate times across the following decades, evidence of sustained defensive concern significant enough to justify repeated major construction investment in fortification rather than in the kind of purely ceremonial or residential construction that had characterized Cahokia's earlier, more expansive growth period. The specific threat this stockade wall was intended to defend against remains genuinely uncertain, some researchers proposing external conflict with rival political powers or raiding groups operating in the wider region, while others suggest the wall may have primarily addressed internal political tension, protecting the city's ruling elite and central ceremonial precinct from potential unrest among Cahokia's own increasingly stressed population as environmental and economic pressures intensified during the city's later period of decline. Skeletal evidence recovered from later Cahokian burial contexts shows some indication of increased violence during this later period compared to earlier phases of the city's history, though the overall pattern remains much less dramatic and less definitively war-related than evidence recovered from some other Mississippian sites elsewhere in the southeast that show clearer indications of organized warfare during roughly this same broader period of regional political and environmental stress. The combination of environmental strain, climate change, and apparent social and political tension evident in Cahokia's archaeological record during its final century of active occupation illustrates a pattern of interconnected crisis that recurs across many documented cases of complex society decline throughout world history. Environmental pressure and political instability frequently reinforcing each other in ways that made the underlying combination of challenges considerably harder for any single society to successfully navigate than either factor might have proven in isolation. This period of apparent instability and gradual decline stands in genuine contrast to Cahokia's earlier, more expansive growth phase, when the city's rapid rise and ambitious monumental construction program suggested a society operating with considerable confidence and considerable coordinated collective purpose. A contrast that itself illustrates how dramatically a society's internal political cohesion and external environmental circumstances can shift across the span of just a handful of generations. The specific construction technique used for Cahokia's defensive stockade, involving deeply set individual posts reinforced with woven wattle and likely covered with protective clay plaster, represented a genuinely substantial engineering undertaking in its own right, requiring considerable coordinated labor investment that itself demonstrates the wider society retained real organizational capacity even during this later period of apparent political and environmental stress. The considerable labor investment required to construct and repeatedly rebuild Cahokia's defensive stockade wall suggests that whatever specific threat motivated its construction was taken seriously enough by the city's leadership to justify diverting substantial coordinated labor away from other construction priorities during a period when the wider society was already apparently experiencing genuine resource and organizational strain. Archaeological evidence from the area immediately surrounding Cahokia's stockade wall, including deposits suggesting rapid, somewhat hasty construction in at least one building phase, has led some researchers to propose the wall may have been erected in direct response to a specific perceived threat rather than as part of a longer planned, more gradually implemented defensive strategy. Comparable defensive fortifications documented at other contemporary Mississippian sites throughout the wider region suggest that Cahokia's stockade construction, however locally significant, reflected a broader pattern of increased defensive concern affecting Mississippian societies generally during this later historical period. By the time European explorers first reached the wider Mississippi Valley region during the 16th and 17th centuries, Cahokia itself had already been substantially abandoned for well over a century, meaning no European observer ever directly witnessed the city during its active period, and the specific indigenous nations that European explorers actually encountered living in the region by this later period had, in most documented cases, no direct oral tradition specifically identifying themselves as Cahokia's own direct descendants or explaining precisely what had happened to cause the city's earlier abandonment. This gap between Cahokia's actual active period and the much later arrival of European written observation created a true historical puzzle that would persist for centuries. Early American settlers and explorers encountering these massive earthen mounds with no living oral tradition immediately available to explain who had built them or why, an information gap that, in a much more scientifically honest intellectual environment, should have prompted careful archaeological investigation rather than the speculative and ultimately racially motivated theorizing that would instead come to dominate American popular and even much scholarly understanding of the mounds for well over a century. Various indigenous nations living in the wider region during the historical period, including groups whose own ancestors may well have descended at least in part from Mississippian populations connected to Cahokia and related sites, did maintain broader oral traditions regarding ancient mound-building ancestors and significant historical migrations, traditions that, while not always providing the kind of precise, specific historical detail that satisfied later scientific investigators demanding exact documentary-style confirmation, nonetheless preserved genuine cultural memory connecting contemporary indigenous communities to this deeper ancestral history that American settler society would spend the following century actively working to deny and obscure. The specific demographic and cultural disruptions that swept across North America following European contact, including devastating disease epidemics that killed enormous percentages of indigenous populations well before most communities ever had sustained direct contact with European colonizers themselves, likely contributed substantially to disrupting and fragmenting whatever more specific oral historical traditions indigenous communities living in the Cahokia region may have maintained. Regarding the site's own particular history, a true tragedy compounding the difficulty of reconstructing Cahokia's story that later, more overtly racist theorizing about a vanished mysterious race would deliberately exploit rather than honestly acknowledge. Early French explorers and missionaries who eventually documented the wider Mississippi Valley region during the 17th century occasionally recorded local indigenous accounts referencing ancient mound-building ancestors, though these fragmentary references rarely provided the kind of specific, detailed historical narrative that later American investigators demanding precise documentary confirmation would have found fully satisfying. The considerable demographic collapse that swept across the Americas following sustained European contact, with some estimates suggesting indigenous populations declined by as much as 90% within the first century following initial contact in various regions, makes reconstructing pre-contact oral history and cultural memory an especially challenging task for researchers working to understand societies like Cahokia that had already declined centuries before European observers arrived. To document anything directly. Archaeologists working today increasingly collaborate directly with tribal historic preservation offices representing nations with documented ancestral connections to the wider Mississippian cultural region, incorporating tribal oral tradition and cultural knowledge into ongoing research design in ways that earlier generations of archaeological investigation at the site never attempted or valued. Oral traditions maintained by various contemporary indigenous nations across the wider Mississippi Valley region, while not always providing precise historical correspondence to specific archaeological findings, nonetheless preserve broader cultural themes regarding ancestral migration, sacred mounds, and historical relationships to the land that resonate meaningfully with the archaeological record even where exact historical details cannot be definitively matched. American settlers and early scientific observers documenting the mounds scattered across the Mississippi and Ohio river valleys during the 18th and early 19th centuries increasingly promoted what historians now call the mound builder myth, a theory proposing that the mounds had been constructed by an ancient, technologically sophisticated, and now entirely vanished race entirely distinct from and racially superior to the Native American nations that European Americans were actively displacing and dispossessing across exactly the same period. This theory gained its widest popular acceptance. Prominent proponents of this theory proposed a really wide range of speculative candidates for the supposed vanished mound builder race, including lost tribes of ancient Israel, refugees from the legendary lost continent of Atlantis, ancient Welsh or Scandinavian explorers who had supposedly reached North America centuries before Columbus, and various other imaginative candidates, each theory sharing the common underlying assumption that the actual ancestors of contemporary Native American nations could not possibly have possessed the organizational sophistication or engineering capability necessary to construct monuments of this scale and complexity. This theory served an explicitly and often quite openly acknowledged political purpose within 19th-century American settler society, providing convenient ideological justification for the ongoing forced removal and dispossession of Native American nations from their ancestral lands by suggesting that contemporary indigenous peoples were themselves merely later, culturally inferior arrivals who had displaced or destroyed the civilized mound builder race, rather than being recognized as the actual direct descendants of the very people who had built these remarkable monuments in the first place. Thomas Jefferson himself, despite conducting one of the earliest documented scientific excavations of a burial mound in North America during the 1780s using methodology actually ahead of its time in its careful stratigraphic attention, nonetheless remained personally uncertain about attributing the mounds directly to Native American ancestors, reflecting how deeply this underlying assumption of indigenous incapability had already become embedded in American intellectual culture even among genuinely careful and really well-intentioned individual observers working during the earliest period of serious American mound investigation. The mound builder myth achieved its widest popular circulation precisely during the same decades when American federal policy was actively pursuing the forced removal of Native American nations from ancestral territories across the eastern United States, a historical coincidence that few serious modern historians consider coincidental at all. The convenient ideological function this theory served for justifying ongoing dispossession, providing real, though rarely explicitly acknowledged, motivation for its remarkably sustained popular and even institutional acceptance across multiple generations of American settler society. Several prominent American scientific societies and museums during the 19th century actively funded and promoted mound builder myth research, lending considerable institutional credibility and financial support to theories that professional archaeologists working with the same physical evidence today would immediately recognize as having no genuine scientific foundation whatsoever. School textbooks and popular history publications throughout much of the 19th and even into the 20th century continued presenting some version of the mound builder myth to American children, ensuring that generations of American students grew up with a factually false understanding of their own continent's ancient history before more accurate archaeological findings gradually worked their way into mainstream educational curricula. Some 19th-century mound builder theorists went so far as to propose elaborate pseudo-scientific racial classification systems attempting to formally distinguish the supposed ancient mound-building race from contemporary Native Americans on the basis of skull measurements and other now thoroughly discredited physical anthropology methods that reflected the broader scientific racism pervasive throughout much of 19th-century American and European intellectual culture. The considerable political convenience the mound builder myth provided for justifying federal Indian removal policy meant that prominent politicians and government officials had their own direct institutional incentive to promote and sustain the theory, a conflict of interest that modern historians examining this period increasingly recognize as a significant, if rarely explicitly acknowledged, factor in the myth's remarkably sustained popular and political influence. The scientific dismantling of the mound builder myth began in earnest during the late 19th century, driven substantially by systematic archaeological survey work conducted under the direction of Cyrus Thomas at the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, a massive research project specifically commissioned to settle the mound builder question through careful, systematic archaeological investigation rather than continued speculation, work that ultimately produced conclusive evidence that the mounds had indeed been constructed by the direct forebears of the very indigenous nation settlers had spent generations denying credit for the achievement. Thomas's Smithsonian Survey, published in 1894 after more than a decade of extensive fieldwork examining mound sites across the entire eastern United States, represented one of the largest coordinated archaeological research projects undertaken anywhere in the world up to that point, and its methodical, evidence-based conclusions helped shift mainstream American scientific opinion decisively away from the mound builder myth, even though the popular version of the theory would continue circulating in less scientifically rigorous contexts for longer afterward. Despite this scientific vindication arriving relatively early, well before many other examples of colonial-era historical denial documented at comparable archaeological sites around the world, the popular cultural damage the mound builder myth had already inflicted proved actually difficult to fully reverse, the false narrative having already shaped generations of American popular education, literature, and general cultural understanding regarding Native American history and capability in ways that persisted considerably longer in general public awareness than the underlying scientific question itself actually remained genuinely contested among professional researchers. Contemporary indigenous scholars and community members working on Mississippian archaeology today continue emphasizing how thoroughly this specific historical episode illustrates a broader pattern in which American settler society repeatedly found ways to deny or minimize indigenous achievement and indigenous historical agency, a pattern that extends much beyond the specific mound builder case to affect how American popular culture and even American educational curricula have historically represented Native American history and capability more broadly across many different specific contexts and time periods. This history of scientific correction arriving faster than genuine popular and cultural correction offers a really instructive case study for understanding how false historical narratives, once established, can persist in general cultural awareness for generations after the underlying scientific or historical question has already been definitively settled among the actual specialists working directly with the relevant evidence. Cyrus Thomas himself reportedly began his own Smithsonian survey work still personally inclined to believe some version of the mound builder myth, making his eventual, evidence-driven conclusion that Native Americans had genuinely built the mounds all the more scientifically significant, since it represented a researcher's own genuine change of professional opinion in direct response to accumulated physical evidence rather than confirmation of a theory he had already firmly held before. Beginning his research. The considerable scale of Cyrus Thomas's Smithsonian survey, ultimately examining thousands of individual mound sites scattered across the eastern United States, required coordinating fieldwork conducted by numerous separate researchers working simultaneously across a wide geographic area. An organizational achievement in its own right that helped establish methodological standards for large-scale archaeological survey work that influenced how similar large-scale research projects would be organized for generations afterward. Subsequent archaeological work throughout the 20th century, building on the foundation Thomas's original survey established, has continued accumulating overwhelming physical evidence connecting Mississippian mound-building traditions directly to the documented material culture of historically known Native American nations. Evidence so extensive and so consistent that no serious contemporary archaeologist working with the actual physical evidence entertains any version of the old vanished race theory today. The eventual triumph of accurate scientific understanding over the mound builder myth stands as one of American archaeology's genuinely significant early achievements, demonstrating that careful, systematic evidence-based investigation could successfully overturn even a deeply entrenched and politically convenient false narrative when pursued with sufficient scientific rigor and institutional support. Modern archaeological research at Cahokia has continued for well over a century since Cyrus Thomas's original Smithsonian survey helped settle the fundamental question of indigenous authorship, incorporating increasingly sophisticated scientific methodology including radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis of human and animal remains, and advanced geophysical survey techniques that have allowed researchers to map buried features across the site without requiring destructive excavation, work that continues refining scholarly understanding of Cahokia's precise chronology, its full geographic extent, and the specific details of daily life for the city's ordinary residents alongside its ruling elite. Cahokia Mound's State Historic Site, established to protect and interpret the core area of the ancient city, received formal recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, one of only a small number of such designations within the continental United States and formal international acknowledgement of the site's true global historical and archaeological significance. A designation that has helped secure ongoing conservation funding and international scholarly attention for a site that, despite its remarkable scale and importance, remains considerably less widely known among the general American public than comparable ancient monuments in other parts of the world. Ongoing conservation challenges at the site include managing erosion and slope stability at Monk's Mound and other major earthworks, addressing the encroachment of modern urban and highway development on portions of the wider ancient city that extend beyond the formally protected core historic site boundary, and securing adequate ongoing funding for both physical site preservation and continued archaeological research, challenges that Illinois state authorities and federal heritage agencies continue working to address even as portions of Cahokia's original extended footprint have already been permanently lost to modern development that occurred before the site's full historical significance had been properly recognized and protected. Contemporary Native American communities, including nations whose own ancestors likely trace at least partial descent from Mississippian populations connected to Cahokia, have increasingly become involved in ongoing site interpretation, research collaboration, and heritage management decisions affecting the site, part of a broader and welcome shift toward ensuring indigenous communities hold meaningful voice and authority regarding how their own ancestral heritage sites are studied, presented, and protected going forward, a collaborative approach standing in deliberate and pointed contrast to the exclusionary and often actively hostile treatment indigenous perspectives received throughout most of the site's earlier investigation history. Educational programming at the Modern Interpretive Center works specifically to correct the historical record damaged by more than a century of mound builder myth circulation, presenting visitors with the scientifically established understanding that Cahokia's builders were the direct forebears of today's Native American nations, an educational mission that carries ongoing importance given how persistently the older, false narrative continued circulating in American popular culture and even some educational materials well into the 20th century. Recent geophysical survey work conducted across sections of the wider Cahokia landscape using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry has identified previously undocumented structures and features extending beyond the boundaries of the formerly protected historic site. Work that continues revealing the true scale of ancient Cahokia likely exceeded even the substantial area currently recognized and protected under its official UNESCO designation. Funding for ongoing conservation and research work at Cahokia comes from a combination of Illinois state government support, federal historic preservation programs, and private philanthropic contributions. A funding structure that heritage management officials have described as chronically insufficient relative to the genuine scale of conservation need presented by a site of Cahokia's size and archaeological complexity. Digital reconstruction projects using contemporary computer modeling technology have allowed researchers and museum curators to create detailed visual reconstructions of how Cahokia's central precinct likely appeared during its active period. Tools that have proven valuable both for ongoing scholarly analysis and for helping modern visitors and students better visualize the genuine scale and complexity of the ancient city. Educational partnerships between Cahokia Mound's State Historic Site and regional universities have expanded considerably in recent decades, providing training opportunities for the next generation of archaeologists and heritage professionals while simultaneously advancing ongoing scholarly research into the site's still incompletely understood full history. The broader significance of Cahokia within the wider history of pre-Columbian North America extends much beyond the specific site itself, offering historians and archaeologists genuine insight into the kind of sophisticated urban planning, monumental engineering, and complex political organization that indigenous North American societies proved fully capable of achieving independently, entirely without any influence or contact from Old World civilizations, directly challenging older, now thoroughly discredited assumptions that once treated pre-Columbian North America as populated exclusively by small-scale, technologically simple societies incapable of urban-level social and political complexity. Cahokia's specific achievement in constructing a true city, complete with sophisticated urban planning, monumental architecture, systematic astronomical observation, and long-distance trade networks connecting it to resources scattered across a continental scale, stands as one of the most historically significant achievements of any indigenous North American society, an achievement that deserves recognition fully comparable to that accorded major urban centers developed independently across other regions of the ancient world, rather than continuing to occupy the marginal position within general historical education that the site has traditionally held relative to its comparative historical importance. The specific historical injustice of the mound builder myth, and the considerable effort required to scientifically and culturally correct it, offers an actually valuable case study for understanding exactly how political power and cultural prejudice can distort even relatively straightforward archaeological questions for multiple generations when the accurate answer directly threatens a dominant society's own convenient justifying narrative, a pattern that recurs in different specific forms. At other archaeological sites around the world where colonial or settler societies found it politically convenient to deny indigenous achievement rather than honestly acknowledge it. Ongoing archaeological research at Cahokia continues yielding genuinely significant new discoveries even after more than a century of accumulated scholarly attention, recent geophysical survey work revealing previously undocumented structures and features across portions of the wider site that earlier, less systematic investigation had never fully mapped. Evidence that the full history of this remarkable ancient city remains, even now, more extensive and considerably less completely understood than even dedicated specialists working directly at the site would have confidently assumed just a few decades earlier. Cahokia's continued relative obscurity within general American historical education and popular awareness, despite its genuine scale and true historical significance fully comparable to much more widely known ancient cities elsewhere in the world, itself illustrates how thoroughly the century-long mound builder myth succeeded in marginalizing this remarkable achievement within mainstream American historical consciousness, a marginalization that ongoing educational and heritage management efforts continue actively working to correct. Comparative historical scholarship examining how other colonial and settler societies around the world have historically denied or minimized indigenous achievement offers valuable context for understanding the specific American mound builder case, revealing recurring patterns of colonial denial that connect Cahokia's own particular history to comparable episodes of historical erasure documented at archaeological sites on other continents facing similar colonial circumstances. International recognition of Cahokia's historical significance through its UNESCO World Heritage designation has helped raise its profile among specialists working in comparative urban archaeology worldwide. Researchers studying early city formation in other parts of the ancient world increasingly citing Cahokia as an important comparative case study alongside better-known ancient urban centers in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and elsewhere. Academic conferences focused specifically on Mississippian archaeology now regularly attract researchers from institutions around the world, reflecting how thoroughly Cahokia and related sites have become recognized as genuinely significant case studies within the broader international field of comparative early urbanism and state formation studies. The broader academic reassessment of pre-Columbian North American urbanism that Cahokia's own case has helped drive continues influencing how historians and archaeologists approach comparable sites throughout the Americas, part of a wider scholarly movement toward taking indigenous American urban and political achievement fully seriously on its own genuine historical merits rather than through the lens of outdated comparative frameworks that once automatically privileged Old World civilizational models. This growing international scholarly attention has, in turn, helped increase public awareness of Cahokia within the United States itself, media coverage and documentary attention gradually working to correct decades of relative obscurity that the site suffered despite its genuine comparative historical significance. Tonight, Monk's Mound still rises above the Mississippi River floodplain exactly where its builders raised it, layer by layer, basket by basket, across more than 2 centuries of continuous construction and expansion, its massive earthen bulk holding within it the compressed physical evidence of a city that once rivaled the largest urban centers anywhere in the medieval world, built entirely by indigenous North American hands using nothing but coordinated human labor, careful engineering, knowledge, and a level of social and political organization that later generations of American settlers found so difficult to credit to Native American ancestors that they invented an entire imaginary vanished race rather than simply accept the straightforward, well-evidenced truth. The city that rose here so suddenly around 1050, that grew to rival London in population, that built astronomical observatories precise enough to track the sun's changing position across the horizon, that maintained trade networks connecting it to resources scattered across a really continental distance, and that eventually declined and emptied out across the following centuries under pressures of environmental strain, climate change, and internal political tension, left behind no written record explaining its own history in its own words, its full story surviving instead through the patient, painstaking work of archaeologists piecing together physical evidence recovered from the ground, one carefully excavated layer at a time. What Cahokia still faces today, ongoing erosion threatening its massive earthen monuments, encroaching modern development pressing against the boundaries of its formerly protected historic core, and the considerable ongoing work still required to fully correct more than a century of deliberate historical denial regarding who actually built this remarkable ancient city, represents a more immediate and considerably more solvable set of challenges than the deeper archaeological questions still surrounding its precise political structure and its exact reasons for decline, challenges that depend now primarily on sustained human attention, sustained funding, and sustained institutional commitment rather than on any further archaeological breakthrough alone. The mounds themselves, patiently built basket load by people whose individual names history never recorded, continue standing exactly where those builders placed them, their massive earthen forms holding within them the physical proof of an achievement that an entire century of deliberate American cultural denial once insisted could not possibly have been accomplished by the very people whose direct descendants continue, to this day, working to ensure their ancestors finally receive the full historical recognition their accomplishment has always actually deserved. Somewhere beneath the sections of ancient Cahokia that modern development has already permanently altered or destroyed, additional physical evidence about the city's full history almost certainly existed before it was lost, a genuine and irreversible loss that stands as its own quiet reminder of exactly what full historical recognition, arriving too late to prevent every consequence of a century of denial, ultimately could not fully undo. What Cahokia's own long, complicated modern history ultimately demonstrates, more than any single archaeological finding recovered from its mounds, is how thoroughly political convenience can distort even a relatively straightforward historical question when the accurate answer threatens a society's own preferred narrative about itself, and how much sustained effort correcting that distortion afterward genuinely requires, work that remains, even now, considerably incomplete. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.